Hi everybody, in this tutorial we are going to create a full stack to-do app using Next.js, Remult, Postgres and NextAuth, and even Tailwind for some CSS. We're going to take this app and deploy it all the way to the cloud using Vercel and Supabase for our database. So let's get started. First thing I want to do is I want to create my next app. So for that I'm going to do npx create next app latest, and I'm going to call it Remult Next.js to do. I'm going to ask for TypeScript and ESLint, and I want to save my source in the source folder. I think that's very useful, so I'm going to say yes, and pretty much I don't care about anything else. Now, Next is currently creating the project for me and installing all the npm packages that it needs. So let's go into the folder we've just created and open VS Code. And here we can see the sources of the files that we need. We're going to use Remult as our full stack framework that will help us interact between the front end and the backend. So I'm going to install Remult. And to configure Remult with Next, we're going to define a catch-all route. So we're going to go to source, pages, API, and we're going to add a new file here with the special catch-all name. That means that any unhandled route will go through this file, and here we'll say import from Remult Next, from Remult Next, and export default Remult Next with an object that we later specify for it. And just for some more configurations that Remult may need, we're going to go to the tsconfig, and we're going to add support for decorators. These are the two flags. And now we can run our code. Let's make it a decent size and navigate to that URL. And the last thing we want to do before we complete our setup is actually clean up the styles from Next, because they're too much. I prefer something simple, and later we'll add a tailwind to do some more configuration. Perfect. So now that we have everything set up, we want to write a to-do app. So our to-do app would have a task entity. And that task entity, we want to share it between the front end and the back end. So under the source folder, we're going to create a new folder called shared. And in it, we're going to create a task TS, which will represent our entity. And it's going to be a basic class. And it's going to have an ID. It's going to have a title and completed. Now, we want to use it. We want to tell Remult to use this task as the code for the front end, for the API, for the database, and everything around it. So to do that, we're going to decorate it with the entity decorator. And we're going to give it a key of tasks. And we're going to say that it's going to allow API CRUD true, which means that we are allowing all different API routes. Later, we'll restrict that, but for now, let's start with everything is open. We're also going to decorate the fields with their specific roles. So the ID field is going to be an auto increment field, the title is going to be a string field, and the completed is going to be a Boolean field. Now, once we've completed configuring this entity, we want to register it with our Remult object. So we're going to say here, entities, task. And as soon as we do that, if you're going to go to localhost 3000 API tasks, we can see that we get an empty array. So just by making that definition and registering it here, we actually got our API working. Now let's just make this Zen mode so we'll have less noise on our screen. And let's go ahead and run a new request. So we're going to go to localhost API tasks, and we see that we get the empty array, and let's go ahead and post the request. So let's create a request with body of title, and it's going to say clean car. Let's say that's my first task. And as soon as I run it, it created the task and brought it back and gave it an ID from the database. And when we run it, we can see here that the task was created. And let's create a few more tasks. I want to read a book. And I want to take a nap. And let's say that I actually done that. So I'm going to say completed true. And pay bills. I definitely didn't do that. And do laundry, which also not yet. And we can see that all of these tasks were created and we can access them through the API. Okay, so just by defining this entity and placing it and registering it in the Remult object, we were able to expose a full CRUD API without writing almost any code. Now let's go ahead and use this API in our front end. So let's go to the index.tsx, which is the main page for the next app. And let's first of all do some cleanup over here. And so it should look like this. And if we go to that page, cool, empty page, that's the way we like it. Let's create a div and an h1 to-dos. Cool, we have it here. Now let's go ahead and get the data from the backend. So the first thing we'll define is a task repo, which is a Remult repo of task. By calling Remult repo task, we're going to get a repository of type tasks that will interact, will cover all the interaction between the front end and the back end regarding the task entity. So the next thing we'll do, we'll create a function, fetch tasks, that will return the task repo find. Find will go and get all the tasks from the backend. Now let's use it in our React code. So we're going to define a task and set tasks state. And we're going to define a use effect that will go and say fetch tasks, then set tasks. Cool. And we can see that we have our tasks by saying here task.length. So we see that we have 5 tasks. Let's go ahead and map them. I'm going to return for every task, we'll return a div with key task ID that will have the title. And let's add also a checkbox, input type checkbox checked task.completed. Okay, so we can see the tasks that we got from the backend, and we've placed them on our HTML. Cool. Great. Now, this is a little bit ugly, so I'd like to style it. So I'm going to style it using Tailwind, and probably you've heard about it. Tailwind is like a great way to create UI these days. They have a very interesting way of doing things, and they quite simplified many things. So let's go ahead and set up Tailwind. So I'm going to open a new terminal window, and I'm going to say npm id tailwind css and post css and auto prefixer. I got this from the Tailwind configuration with Next, so you can just take it online. And then we're going to run npx tailwind css init p, which will configure Tailwind. And it created a tailwind config.js. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. We're going to grab tailwind config.js, and we need to tell it where can it find the source code. So we're going to say here, you're going to find the source code in source, pretty much everywhere there, and we're going to want you to process TS and TSX files. And next, we need to go back to the CSS and say here that we want to use Tailwind base and Tailwind components and Tailwind utilities. All of these are the configuration steps that are required for Tailwind. And then we're going to stop our development server and start it again. And we'll be able to see that the look and feel has a little bit changed with the basic configuration of Tailwind. What Tailwind basically does is they clean up everything and they let you configure whatever it is you want the UI to be. So we're going to go back to our index.tsx and we'll start formatting our classes. So the first thing you want to do, we want this to have a class name of bggray 50. So we want to have a gray background. Great. And we want to have it a full screen. And then we want to say flex items center and flex call. Great. And actually also justify center. Great. And we'll say that we also want it to have text large. Great. Now for the H1, we want to say class name. Let's start with text red 500. And we want to be big, so it's going to go to 6XL. 6XL. And we also want to make it italic, because, you know, it's cool. And let's format, let's add a main div over here, main section. And start formatting it. We want it to have BG white. Okay, and we want it to have a border, which is going to be rounded. And we want it to have also a shadow. Cool. And margin of 5. And we want it to have the full width. But we don't want it to be too big, so we're going to say something like this. That way we can scale it when we grow things. And let's format our divs here. Let's say that we want to have a border button. So we'll have a line between our different tasks. And we're going to say that it has a padding of x of 6, so it's not going to be that stuck to the ends of it. And gap 2. And actually with gap we want to have flex and items center. Okay, great. And the checkbox itself, we're going to say that we want it to be with a width of 6 and a height of 6. Cool. And I also want some padding over here. So we'll have some padding. Great. So we have our list ready and formatted and set. So much for formatting. Let's take another look at what we've done earlier. So we've defined the task repo. We use the fetch task method to get the task from the backend, and we set the state over here. Now, we can actually do a lot more with this. For example, we can say, hey, you know what? Please limit this to 2, and it will only go and get 2 tasks from the backend. Let's open the developer tools on the network tab and see what happens here. We can see that it makes an API call to the backend requesting only 2 tasks. Okay, I can then say page 2 and get page number 2. I can go ahead and say order by completed ascending, and it will place the completed task at the end, or descending will place them at the start, and ascending will place them at the end. Or I can say where and say completed true, and it will only show me the completed tasks or the uncompleted tasks, or show me all. So with Remult, it was very simple to define all these complex API endpoints with fully typed query language from the frontends that we can use to query data from the backend. And we can make sophisticated queries and get the data and make it all easy. Now, once we've done that, let's go ahead and start playing with editing the data. The first thing we want to do is to be able to add a new task. So to do that, we're going to start by defining a new task title state. Use state with blank. And let's add a form here and add an input with value of new task title, and on change would say set new task title with e target value. Let's see that we've got our input. We've got some input over here. Cool. Let's give it a placeholder of what needs to be done. And let's add a button with add. Okay, cool. Now let's go ahead and implement the actual add task functionality. So we're gonna add a function called add task. It's gonna accept a form event. And the first thing it's gonna do, it will prevent its default because we don't want it to submit the form. We'll add a try catch with an alert. And then we'll say, okay, the new task with await task repo insert with title new task title. The call to task repo insert will issue a post request to the backend, create a new title in the database, and return the new task back to us. And then we'll set it to the tasks array. New task. Yeah, this should be without the S. And we'll also set the new task title to blank so we can start adding more tasks. Let's go ahead and use it. So in our form, we're going to say on submit add task. So now we can add a new task. And we can see that a post request was made to the backend. Then the new task was created and we can see it. Okay, now that we can add tasks, let's add the ability to set tasks as completed. We want that whenever this checkbox is checked, we want it to respond, and we want it to also set database. So to do that, we're going to go to our map, and we're going to define a const set task, which is going to get a value of type task. And this will actually just set a task state in the task state in the tasks array. So we're going to say set tasks to task.map, and if the task is the current task, then replace it with the values that we're setting. Otherwise, keep the task from the original array. And then we're going to say const set completed, which is going to get a completed boolean, and it's going to say set task to await task repo save of the task with the new completed value. And we'll call it in the on change of the set task title. So we're going to say set completed of the completed checkbox. So we're going to say set completed with e target value checked. Cool. Now let's check a few tasks, and we can see that the put request is being set to the backend, and these tasks have been set. Now, actually, so far we haven't defined a database, so we're using a very simple JSON database that we can see over here. And one of the fun parts about it is that if we change values, we can see it respond in real time to what we do. Later, of course, we'll replace it to use a Postgres database on the cloud and have a lot of fun with that as well. So we've set the task as completed, and the next thing we need to do is to allow them to rename the tasks. And then we'll style it a little bit. But let's go ahead and allow them to rename the task. So we're going to go to index.tsx, and we're going to say const set title. It's going to get a title string, and it's going to set the task with the current task value and the new title. And we're going to add a const save task, which is going to be like this, and we're going to call it with some kind of save buttons that we're going to add. So here again, we're going to make a try, a catch with an arrow, and alert error message. And on the try, we're going to say set task with await task repo save of the task. And we'll call the set title in an input that we'll create. Input value task title. On change, set title with target value. And we're going to add a button which will be called save, and on click we're going to say a save task. Okay, so now we have here an input, and we can say do laundry 1, 2, 3, click save, and it will make a put request to the backend and update our data. We can see that in our data over here, the do laundry was updated, and we can delete this and save, and it will save the change. Cool. Let's go ahead and add a delete, and then we'll do a little bit of formatting for this, so we'll have a bit more fun. So we're going to define here const delete task. So it's going to await task repo delete of task. You know what, let's also add a try and a catch here. And we'll do this. And we say alert error message. And here we'll say set tasks to task.filter where it's not the task that was just deleted. So now we'll add a button, delete, and we'll say here on click equals delete task. And we can delete our new task, and it will send a delete call to the backend, and we'll delete the data from our database. Now that we've added the functionality, let's go ahead and style it a little bit using Tailwind again. So what I really want to do here, let's take a look at the form, and we're going to give it a class name, and we'll say that we want it to be border bottom 2. We want to have a bold border in between, and we want it to have a padding of 6 on its X scale and padding of 2 on its top, and a gap of at least 2 with flex. And we want to have yes, we want the input to be width full. So we'll take the entire width. And let's do something similar to the inputs that we have below. So this input will have a class name of width full, and yeah, I think it looks pretty good for now. You know what, let's change these icons to be nicer icons. So the guys at Tailwind created a website called Icon Hero, or Hero Icon, I can never remember, heroicons.com, and I can go ahead and search for icons here. So I can search for add. I'll get this nice icon for add, so I'm going to copy it to JSX and replace the add text here with this JSX and format it. So now we have a nice plus over here. And let's do the same for save. I'm going to take check, and I'll replace save with check. I got a nice little save over here, and let's go with delete. Trash looks like a good one. Copy it, paste it here. So now it's formatted with a delete button, and we can see that it all works. So a new task, it's added, we can change it, and it's saved, and we can delete it, and it gets deleted. So there you go. You can see how with Remult, only by defining this simple task entity and registering it on our endpoint, we were able to have a full CRUD capability from the frontend to the backend, allowing update, insert, delete, read with a query language with server-side paging, sorting, and filtering. All of that with just a few lines of code by defining the entity and registering it where we did. Now, another topic that comes to mind is actually validation. We want to validate our data. That's something that we do quite a lot. And that's something that we always get wrong when we do websites, because we got front-end validation and back-end validation. Sometimes we can get the logic wrong. Sometimes we can get different validations. And it's one of those pain points that we've seen a lot in many applications. So when you use Remult, you actually define your validation on the entity level, and that same validation is used by the front-end and the back-end. Let me show you how it works. So I'm going to go to the title field, and I'm going to add an options variable over here saying validate, and I'm going to say validators dot required. And as soon as I do that and refresh my website, if I'll try to submit a new task, it will give me an error. Now note that the network tab is empty. It gives me the error as a front-end validation. It didn't call the backend to do that. Let's try and bypass that and make an API call to the backend. So we're going to go to our new request. We're going to make a post with an empty task. And we'll get the same validation code running on the backend, giving me the same validation error. So we can define our errors in a single source of truth over here and have it used both on the front end and the backend. And we can also create custom validations. We don't have to have something built in. So I can say here, task, if task title length is less than 3, throw error too short. And as soon as I do that, if I try to add a task, I will get a too short error. Actually, yeah, I just need to refresh it. I'll get a too short error over here. And if I try to do it on the back end by bypassing the front end, I'll get the too short error over here. So the task actually starts serving as the single source of truth, not only for the typing, but also for validations and later some other cool stuff. The next requirement that my user gave me, he says that they want to have a button to set all the tasks as completed. So let's go ahead and implement that. I'm going to switch over to our index.tsx, and I'm going to add a button called, a method actually called set all completed. And it's going to be an async, and it's going to get a completed Boolean value. And we wanted to iterate all the tasks, not just the tasks that we're seeing. So we're going to iterate all the await task repo find, which will bring me all the tasks from the backend. And for every task, I'm going to say await task repo save with the task info and the completed parameters that I'm getting. And eventually, I'm going to say fetch tasks, then set task when I want to reload the tasks after the update. Now, to the HTML, we're going to go and add a section here with button set all completed, that is going to be on click. Going to call set all completed with true. And I'm going to add another one just like this with let's format it a little bit. Let's give it a class name of BG color, BG blue 700 or 600. And okay, it's going to look like this. So let's add text color, text white. Great. And let's add a padding to the x of 3 and padding to y of 1. And let's give it a smaller text a little bit. Let's actually say that it's font semi-bold. Cool. And rounded large. And for this section, I'm going to say that it has a border top, because we want to have a significant line to its top. And we're going to say a px6 and p2, because we want to have padding of the right of 6 and padding of the top of 2. Gap 4. And yeah, also flex. Perfect. Now let's duplicate our button. and say set all uncompleted with set completed false. And I just want to say here also that it's going to be justify between. That way they'll be aligned to the ends of the UI. Cool. So here we have these two buttons, and they're actually formatted, and when we click on them, they do what we want them to do. They go ahead and set everything. Now, I'm happy, my user may be happy, but my boss not so much. Because if you look at the network tab, you can see that every call like this makes multiple calls to the backend. And if you have just 5 tasks, that's okay. But if I have 500 tasks or 5,000 tasks, this can become very slow. So let's go ahead and refactor this code to be used on the backend. So I'm going to go to the set all completed method, and I'll copy it. And then I'm going to go to the shared folder and create a new class called tasks controller. With the export class tasks controller. And I'm going to pass the set completed method over here. And instead of being a function, I'm going to make it a static async method. And then I'll decorate it with the backend method decorator from Remult. And say that it's allowed true. The backend method decorator tells Remult that whenever you're about to call this code, instead of running it in the front end, make an API call to the backend and run it. And next we'll just get the task repo like we've done before. Remult, repo of task. Previously, the Remult repo returned the repositories that interacts with the backend, but since we're running on the backend, it's going to return repositories that interacts directly with the database. We don't need the fetch task over here, and we just need to register it with Remult. So we're going to say here, controllers, tasks controller, and on our front-end code, instead of having this for loop, we'll replace it with await task controller set all completed. And now when I call the set all completed, I get only one call to the backend and another call to refresh the data. This way I was able to move code from the front end to the backend without having to change almost anything. The idea here is that the repositories that we get back from Remult, if it runs on the front end, we'll make API calls to the backend, and if it runs on the backend, we'll call the database directly. So the same style of writing serves us both in the front end and the backend. So we've covered sharing code between front end and backend, sharing typing between front and backend, sharing validation between front end and backend. And the next most important concern is authentication and authorization. Every application has rules and not everybody can do anything. For example, in our application, we only want to have authenticated users be able to see the tasks. So to do that, I'm going to change the allow API CRUD here to be allow authenticated. Okay. Once I do that, I will no longer see the data because my user is not authenticated. You can see I've got a forbidden error over here. And we actually want to do the same also to the backend method. Only authenticated users are allowed to call this backend method. And then if I'll try to call it without having the proper authentication, I'll get an error that I'm not authorized. Now to implement authentication, we're going to use NextAuth here. So let's open a terminal window and install NextAuth. Now NextAuth has some environment variables that they need, so we're going to add a new file called .env.local, and in it we'll set the NextAuth secret to something very, very secret. I'm going to go and grab a UUID from the web, and this secret is used by NextAuth to maintain the session and maintain security. It's important to set it to something that is completely random. Now, once we've done that, we're going to need to start setting up NextAuth. So under API, we're going to create a new folder called auth. Under API, we'll create a new folder called auth, and in it, we're going to do a catch-all auth next route. Actually, I think it's NextAuth. Yeah, NextAuth. NextAuth route. And here we'll define what we need. So we first of all going to need a NextAuth next, which we're going to call NextAuth. And then we're going to import a credentials provider from NextAuth providers credentials, and this credentials provider will help us find users, use our own sign-in to authenticate users. And let's define a list of valid users. It's going to be of type user info from Remult, and we're going to have two users. The first one's going to be ID 1, name Jane. The second one will have an ID 2 and name Steve. So we have our users, and we'll export the NextAuth component by defining a provider for it, the credentials provided we just imported, and then we need to explain to it how to use the credentials. So it's going to ask the users using the credentials definitions for a name, and that name is going to have a label of a username and a placeholder to say try Steve or Jane, because we want to help our users actually sign into our code. And it's going to have an authorize method that's going to help it find the user. So it's going to say go to the valid users and find a user where the username is the same as the credentials that were provided name, or null, because if you don't find user, that's okay also. So yeah, let's just make sure that we've got it right. I need a close parens here. This one should delete. Yeah, this is the time to make. Cool. So now we have it set over here. Let's just format it a bit so we can see it. So this is how we find the user. Let's see how it works now. I'm going to go back to our code, and I'm going to refresh it, which is okay. We actually haven't set anything in the front end. So let's go ahead and set the relevant front end code. The first thing we need to do is to touch the app.tsx and import into it from NextAuth React. We're going to add a session provider, and then we're going to say that the page props will also get a session and the rest of page props. And we're going to add a section here called session provider. It's going to get a session from the session, and we're going to return this, not return that, and remove the semicolon. So that's how we wrapped our component with NextAuth session provider. And now it looks like this, still nothing. And the next thing we want to do is in our code actually force a sign in if the user is not signed in. So let's go ahead to our index.tsx, and we're going to add const session use session from NextAuth React. And in the use effect, we're going to say if session status is unauthenticated, run sign in from React, from NextAuth, of course. So let's do that, and we can see that we are signed out. And you can see that what we've placed here in the label is displayed here, and what is displayed here in the placeholder is displayed here. So that's kind of cool. And we can sign in as Jane. And here we are signed in, but still we can't see any tasks. And that's because we haven't told Remult who the user is. So to do that, we're going to export a function here, async function, of course. It's going to be called get user from NextAuth. And it's going to get a request. And it's going to define a token, which we're going to get from NextAuth, from the request. And we'll search the valid users for a user where the user ID is equal to the token sub. Yes, we need to await the get token. Great. And in the Remult code, we're going to tell it get user from NextAuth. And this will tell Remult who the current user is. And as soon as we'll refresh, now we'll see that we get the task because the user was authenticated, and now they're allowed to get the task and also set all completed and uncompleted. Now I also want to add a sign out button, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to jump to our index.tsx. I'm going to add a section here at the top saying hello. And I'm going to take session.data.user.name. So we see hello Jane, and I'm going to add a button for sign out, which is going to call sign out by React, by NextAuth React. So we have the sign out button over here, and let's give this a bit of formatting. So we're gonna say here flex, and yeah, we got flex and class name flex and justify between. Good. And we want to have a padding x of 6 and a padding of 2. And yeah, I think this looks pretty good. We can actually add a border bottom, so we'll have a line in between. Cool. So now if we sign out, we can sign back. Sign out, sign out, sign out. On click, I'm calling the sign out method. I am signed out, but for some reason I'm still getting this look and feel here. If session, yeah, we also need to add session over here, so it would recompute when the session changes. Perfect. So we sign Steve. We see data with Steve. We'll sign out. We are signed out, and we'll do Jane, and we see data with Jane. So here we go. In 5 minutes, we implemented NextAuth and user-based authentication. If the user is part of our allowed user list over here, then they can do the operations. And the last thing I want to talk from this perspective is actually adding role-based authorization. There are some operations that are only allowed for admins, in our case, Jane. So let's go ahead and tell that Jane is an admin. I give it an array of roles and the roles I want to give it. And now I can assign things to it. I can say that, for example, the ability to create a task is only for an admin. And the ability to delete a task is also only for an admin. And even the title itself, I'm not going to allow it for anyone who is not an admin to update. Now, as soon as I do that, Jane can still do whatever she wants. She can add a task. She can edit the test title and save it. And she can even delete a task. But if we sign out and sign back in as Steve, who is not an admin, if he'll try to delete a task, he'll get a forbidden error. And also if he'll try to add tasks, he'll get a forbidden error. So the task class represents as a single source of truth for everything that resolves the task. It can be the field that it has, the type, the validation, the authorization, the authentication, and we can use the same code in our frontend and backend to interact with the task entity. So now that we've completed our application, let's go ahead and make it production ready. The first thing I want to do is use an actual database. So let's go over to Supabase and set up a Postgres database. So here I am at supabase.com. I'm going to create a new project. And I'm going to say new project, and the project's name is going to be Remult Next Demo. And I'm going to give it a password it's going to generate, and I'm actually going to copy this password and just put it in my env file so I won't forget it. And region is going to be, let's go for UK, and create new project. So Supabase is now creating the project for me, and in the meantime I'm going to add to my code whatever my code needs to be able to run Postgres. So I'm going to do here npm i pg, which is the Postgres client for Node.js. And in our Remult code, actually before that, in our env, we want to set a database URL command parameter, database URL environment variable that later we're going to get it from Supabase, and we'll be able to use it to interact from our code to the database. So we're going to add that in a second. And in Remult itself, we're going to import from Remult Postgres the create Postgres connection. And we're going to say here that the data provider is create Postgres connection. Now the create Postgres connection will automatically go and read the database URL defined over here. We can customize a connection string if you want. We can say connection string whatever, but since we want to use an environment variable, we'll use this one. And to get the environment variable out of Supabase, let's make this full screen for a second. And we're gonna go over to settings, to database, scroll down to connection string, copy this connection string, and let's place it back where it was. And we'll replace the password with this password. Great. So we'll save this, and we'll send a via Remult code, and we'll go over to our website and refresh it, and you can see that it actually created a new table for us. And yeah, okay, so Supabase has done a restart for us, so let's just make another change and restart, and it will be a bit nicer. But we could see that it has created the table for us with the columns and values as we need them. Okay, and now let's go ahead and add a new task like wash car, and it's forbidden because I'm Steve. So let's sign out, sign back in as Jane, and say wash car. Cool. Take a nap. And we can check things as done, check all completed, check all uncompleted, and all the data get updated real time to our Postgres database. We can actually see it if we go to Supabase and look at our tables, and we can see the task tables with the data over here. Okay, so if we add a new task, a workout, and we can see it over here as soon as we click refresh, we can see the workout task created in Supabase in our database. So now that we've connected to a database and have everything working with a database in the cloud, it's about time to deploy our application to the cloud. So to do that, we'll need to first of all deploy our code to GitHub. So I'm going to say over here first deploy, hoping that it's the first and last, but let's see what happens now. And then I'm going to publish my branch to GitHub. I'm going to call it a Remult Next.js to do. Yes, sounds about right. And I'll make it a public repository in case you ever want to search for it and read it and see what I've done here. So I'm going to push it to GitHub, and once it's complete, I'm going to go over to Vercel and ask Vercel to create a new project for me. And it's going to go to my Git repository, and it's going to show me this repository that we've just committed. So I'm going to say import. And in the environment variable sections, I need to set the environment variables that we have in our .env file. So NextAuth secret. It can be the same secret, it can be a different secret, whatever you choose. And database URL. Perfect. Add and deploy. Now it's deploying to Vercel. It's building the site, running the site and everything. It's going to be up in a few seconds. But you could see how in a very short period of time we were able to create a full stack application using Next.js, Remult as our ORM and API and front-end query code. Pretty much for anything CRUD, Remult was used over here. The UI was polished by Tailwind, and the database we eventually used is Postgres using Supabase hosted cloud and Vercel to deploy. And here we go. We actually got this nice confetti here. Let's click on our website, and we can see that we need to sign in as Jane. And once we've signed in, we can actually see the tasks that we've added to the database. And a new task from the cloud. Enter, and we can see that tasks was added successfully. So that's it for our tutorial. Obviously, you can do a lot more with Remult. There's so much more you can do. Relations between entities and live queries, and use that same metadata in the front end, and we'll create more tutorials to do a lot more around here. I invite you to visit our GitHub. So it's going to be GitHub Remult, and star our project. We really love those stars. And if you have a question, drop in at our Discord, or open an issue, or start the discussions. Let us know what you think. Thanks so much for watching, and see you on our next video.